Welcome to Key Factors for Perfect Kombucha. Hi, I'm Hannah from the Kombucha Mama, and along with my husband and partner Alex Kombucha, we are the founders of the Kombucha Camp Workshop. The workshop started in my home in 2004 as a class. So people would come to my house, I'd share with them the magic of kombucha, they'd leave with a SCOBY, and this came out of my desire to teach other people about kombucha. I had first discovered it in 2003, and for me it was love at first sip. But it wasn't until I took an Artist's Way workshop later that year that I was inspired to teach others. And that is how the Kombucha Camp Workshop was born. In 2007, right when blogging was becoming more popular, that's when I started kombuchacamp.com. It was just an informational website. I was very frustrated by the lack of quality information about kombucha. There was a lot of myths, a lot of misinformation as well. And so this was a way to sort of set the record straight. It's been through many evolutions since then, and in 2010 we also launched our store, and that was a result of people reaching out to us asking if we had any cultures available for purchase, and so it just organically grew of its own accord. As I like to think, the kombucha was leading us down this path and just organically has helped us to grow over time. And our love of kombucha and our mission of changing the world one gut at a time directly dovetailed with the desire to help the commercial industry succeed. In 2010, there was a withdrawal of kombucha, and it caused a big ruckus in the industry, and it really could have had a very detrimental effect if not for the fact that kombucha is just one of these beverages that really captivates people and also creates a physiological reaction when they consume it. And so in 2014, we founded Kombucha Brewers International, where I'm the president and Alex is the chairman of the board. And in just 5 years, we have done some tremendous work. So if you're at all considering going commercial or want to learn more about that, check out kombuchabrewers.org. Now, our love of kombucha became distilled into a 400-page book. So we gave birth to this giant book in March of 2016, and it is what we like to call a fun textbook. Of course, it's going to have tips, recipes, techniques, how-to. Also has an appendix with all of the elements of kombucha, related scientific studies. It talks about the history of kombucha. There's a massive timeline. So this is for anybody who wants to make kombucha or even just enjoys drinking it to learn more about the product. But it's a fabulous resource. Highly recommend it. And we also are consultants to the industry, and we love what we do. We love educating people, and our motto is trust your gut, which means don't do what I do. Don't listen to what my body says works for me. It's really about reconnecting with that DNA wisdom that lives within your body, that's billions of years old, and that literally has all the intuitive information you need in order to ensure you're eating right for your body. So trust your gut is about listening to the biofeedback and adjusting based on that information. And kombucha has really given us our ethics, and that is healthy boundaries is what creates a healthy culture. And of course, in order to create healthy boundaries, first you have to have quality information. You have to know what it is we're talking about here. And then, of course, when you're ready to start brewing kombucha, you want to start with quality supplies. Unfortunately, I think quality is something that is often overlooked in our bottom line focused capitalistic culture that we currently live in. But when you select quality supplies, you are not only getting a quality start to your process, but it also comes with quality support, which means you have people who are experts in the field helping to guide you throughout your process. So we're really excited to have you here to learn about the key factors for perfect kombucha. So we're going to go over a lot of different topics here in great depth. Of course, it won't be as in detail as the book, but it's going to give a really great understanding of the different ins and outs of brewing kombucha. But let's start with looking at what kombucha is and is not. Because kombucha is sort of new to the mainstream fermented foods, people tend to ascribe it mysterious properties. And that, of course, is helped by the fact that it's been called for a really long time the tea of immortality, the tea of long life. And so it makes sense that people would ascribe mystical qualities to it. And while certainly all fermented foods are mystical in and of their own right, microbes are magic and they are the ones executing all of this fermentation process. They're enhancing the nutrient value. And of course, we can't see them. And that's why I call them magic, because magic is when you can't see how the process is being done. But it really is just a fermented food. It's incredibly safe, just like all fermented foods, to brew at home. Um, it provides nutrition in a living form. Again, another topic of conversation that is woefully overlooked in our current society, because when we talk about quality and nutrition, it means we're probably not talking about the zillions of aisles of processed foods that sure are fun and have great words like low fat and sugar free, but don't necessarily mean they're delivering any nutritional value. And of course, kombucha is safe for any healthy being to consume, and that extends beyond the human family to our animal friends, our plants. Everything really loves and benefits from kombucha. So what kombucha is not, it's not a drug. It's not going to cure anything. It's not a panacea. It's not something that you're going to take and miraculously overnight everything's going to be healed and solved. So it's also not easy to contaminate, and that's because of the low pH and the healthy organic acids that it creates through the fermentation process. And so we often get people worried, how do I know if bad bacteria have gotten in there? The reality is it's a food. So like any other food, it's going to get mold. It's going to immediately show you that there's something wrong with it. And so you don't have to worry like, oh, what if something's happening that I can't see? Everything is going to be very visible at the surface. And of course, kombucha is not for everyone. There are people who don't like Brussels sprouts. There are people who don't eat cheeseburgers, right? So kombucha is not necessarily going to be for every person or flavor profile. However, people who do choose to consume it, include it in their life, often find they engage in a long, lovely, healthy relationship. So it definitely is possible for everybody to enjoy it, but it may not be right for you, and it may not be right for you right now. We'll get into a little bit more of that as we continue. So let's go to the basics, right? What is kombucha? Essentially, it is tea vinegar. That's right. It's a fermentation process. It's an acetic acid ferment like vinegar. And if you've ever purchased raw apple cider vinegar, you will notice that it also contains a mother that looks very similar to our kombucha culture. And that's because they share some bacteria in common, specifically Acetobacter, Gluconacetabacter. These organisms, which have aceto in the name and clearly make acetic acid, they also create bacterial cellulose, which is what our SCOBY is made of. So SCOBY is an acronym, meaning it likes to use its initials, and it stands for Symbiotic Culture of Bacteria and Yeast. Very straightforward description. So the bacteria, as I mentioned, are Acetobacter, Gluconacetabacter, and our yeast are typically Brettanomyces bruxellensis, although we can sometimes see some Saccharomyces in there as well. But acetic acid, just to give some perspective, vinegar is legally defined as being 4 to 8% acetic acid. Kombucha, however, is a really mild acetic acid, coming in under 1% typically. And that's why we can enjoy drinking a glass of kombucha over ice, whereas a glass of vinegar over ice would likely leave us cringing and not able to finish it. And we've often referred to kombucha as 21st century yogurt so that people sort of understand. And many of us may not even remember yogurt before it was sold in the grocery stores. But back in the mid 20th century, you couldn't buy yogurt at the store. You had to make it yourself, just like kombucha. It was a counterculture. And it only started to become commercialized around the 60s and 70s when Dannon started running ads for it. And now, of course, we see it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And unfortunately, a lot of the traditional fermentation, the great diversity that comes from the fermented food known as yogurt, has been lost through food processing techniques. So our base ingredient, the most important ingredient that is in kombucha is tea. Tea refers specifically to Camellia sinensis. And Camellia sinensis is a beautiful plant. It's a bush. It's a camellia bush. And it was discovered, according to legend, about 5,000 years ago. Shennong, the emperor god of agriculture in China, was boiling his water, which is just interesting to note in and of itself, because even 5,000 years ago, people understood that water could be insanitary, and so it needed to be boiled. And as the legend goes, some leaves floated off of this bush and fell into his cup of boiling water. Well, not realizing they were there, he lifted the cup to his lips, he took a sip, and the energy, the clear, focused energy that he received from consuming that really is what led to the cultivation and the status given to tea in the Chinese culture. So tea, as we can see, contains a lot of nutrients. It has catechins, EGCG. Looking for how I say this, epigallocatechin. So it's a little EGCG is a little bit easier to say. And when we look at EGCG, look at this chemical drawing, right? So all nutrients have chemical drawings that represent where the carbon bonds, oxygen bonds, hydrogen are all fused together, and it gives it a unique shape. And if we look down here, just below that image, we can see there's a couple other images of different types of elements found in tea. Well, we can think of these drawings as a representation of, they're like keys. And so think about a key when it goes into the lock. If the grooves aren't perfectly matching up, it can be really difficult to turn that key, and in fact, you may not even be able to unlock it. And so nutrients in a living form have key shapes that our body has evolved to recognize and instantly utilize. And so when you get vitamin C from tea, when you get vitamin B2 or EGCG, your body instantly knows what to do with those. It uptakes that nutrition instantly. Now, here's the problem. Our food supply, as we know, has been depleted of nutrients over time, and so that has led to supplementation with synthetic vitamins. Well, synthetic vitamins and synthetic nutrients are created in a lab, but their chemical structure will never exactly replicate what's found in nature. And so when we consume synthetic nutrients, what they've learned over time is that our bodies may not even be getting the nutrients we're looking for. And in fact, it can lead to the exact opposite of what you're hoping to solve with that nutrient, because that synthetic form, the key, isn't fitting correctly, and therefore it's creating other problems. And then, some of the other things we've learned is like with the vitamin B12, there's certain people who have a mutation in their gene where they literally cannot absorb the synthetic form, and in fact, it makes their bodies worse when they do. And so it's really crucial to understand that while supplementation with synthetic nutrients can be important at certain times, you really want to go to your plant friends, you want to go to your herb friends, you want to see what you can get from your food source first before going to supplementation. So again, we're not saying supplementation is bad, we're just saying it's better to get it in that living form wherever possible. Now, one of the other things that we hear about tea is that it has caffeine, and that kombucha makes people feel really energized. And they're always asking me, how do I decaffeinate the tea? How can I make a more decaf blend of kombucha? And certainly there are teas you can do that with, and there's some listed in the shopping guide, but specifically we can see in the graphic here in the right hand corner that kombucha, after the fermentation process, actually has less caffeine than the tea that was used to make it. And that's because the caffeine stimulates the yeast just like it stimulates us, and it spurs that fermentation process forward. And so this is where we see black tea, which is what kombucha was traditionally made of, as being one of the best nutrients for the kombucha culture. It's high in catechins, it has purines and other things, it has great nitrogen present, and so it really has all of the nutrients that the kombucha culture needs in order to thrive. But us humans, I'm sipping on some tea right now. As humans, we really love variety, and we can't help but experiment and try different things, and that's awesome. And so what that means is different types of tea are also used for making kombucha. And in fact, as long as it's Camellia sinensis, you're going to be able to propagate the culture. Now, some types of tea have more nutrients than others. So while white tea will yield a really light, flavorful kombucha, you may notice that your SCOBY doesn't grow as well because it's missing out on some of the nutrients that you get when the tea is further oxidized. So let's just talk about the different types of tea. I didn't know this until I started making kombucha, but all tea, black tea, green tea, white tea, oolong, pu'er, what we see here, all of it comes from the same plant, Camellia sinensis. How it's grown, where it's grown, when the leaves are plucked, how the leaves are processed after they're plucked is what leads to these varieties. And so white tea is actually the youngest leaves with the buds and is the least processed. And by processed, what I mean is exposed to heat. It's also called oxidation because when it's exposed to heat, those elements oxidize or turn darker in color. So the white tea is the least oxidized and therefore has the lightest flavor. And then you get into the green teas. Often these are, they can be fried in a wok. They might be exposed to sun. But again, they're not allowed to get to that point where they turn dark in color. And so this is where we get these interesting varieties of teas is in how they're processed. And that's also why they have different brewing temperatures. As you can see, a dark tea likes a higher temperature as that's going to help extract those nutrients better. Green teas like it a little a cooler temperature, same with the white tea. Pu'er is a special type of tea that's been fermented in bricks. I don't know, maybe I had a dream. I heard this story about how pu'er tea came into being and I've literally never been able to find it again, but I'll share it here with you because who doesn't like a good myth? My understanding was pu'er, right? Tea was really prized, and monks would cultivate tea patches, and then you would have marauding tribes that would come through, and they would come pilfer the monasteries and take all of their supplies. Well, they didn't want them to come and take their tea, so what they did is they buried it outside in the ground and hid it from the marauders. Well, they forgot it was there, and when they came back and unburied it, what they discovered was that the microbes in the dirt had created some sort of fermentation process. And so this tea is really dark in color and yet has a very mild flavor. And how this tea is processed and cultivated has been kept a secret, but cakes of pu'er are prized and can be very expensive, just like expensive bottles of wine, and are aged just like wine is. And so there's a whole world of really great teas out there that people can explore. So pu'er is a really great one to work with as well. And then there's different teas and tisans we can use for blending. While kombucha is traditionally a tea and sugar ferment in primary fermentation, especially when we have extra scobies, we can get very experimental. So for those wanting a caffeine-free kombucha, you might not use any tea at all. In fact, you could use hibiscus, you could use ginger, you could use cinnamon. So there's a variety of elements and nutrients that can be used in the primary fermentation process that will yield a very delicious kombucha. Now we make, and here's the other thing, like when I was first making kombucha, I would rip open each individually wrapped tea bag, right? So here I am, I've got this massive pile, I make 2 gallons of kombucha, I've got like 8 tea bag pieces of paper, I'm throwing away the paper the tea is in, there's a tag, there's a staple, and I've always been sort of an environmentalist at heart. And so seeing all that garbage, I was like, what am I doing? This is crazy. Yes, it's a great way to use up all those random teas you have in your cupboard. But once you go through those, where's the best way to get your tea? Well, loose leaf tea is a lot less expensive. You can tend to get a higher quality tea, and that's what led me to create my own blend. Once I understood that loose leaf tea was the way to go, I just dove in and got really creative. And so Hannah's Special Tea Blend is an all-organic blend of green teas, black teas, white tea, yerba mate, and rooibos. So we do add some of those tisans for flavor and health benefit. People love it. They buy it by the pound. But of course, find the tea that works for you, the flavor that you enjoy, and of course don't be afraid to mix it up. So changing your tea from time to time can also yield different flavors of kombucha. Now I did make a mistake once, and some people will like this flavor and other people won't, but I had run out of a certain type of tea for my blend, and I had some Lapsang Souchong. Well, Lapsang Souchong is a type of tea that is smoky. It's super smoky. It's like roasted over smoky coals, and I put that in, and that totally threw off my entire blend. So sometimes the tea will have a positive impact and sometimes it can end up with a flavor profile you weren't aiming for. But have fun exploring the world of tea. So sugar. I know you're looking at this and you're thinking, what? Sugar, a vital nutrient? This is blasphemy. Everything I read tells me about how sugar feeds cancer and sugar and candida and sugar is the devil and let's kill sugar. All right, let's calm down and take it back a notch here. So first of all, let's recognize that sugar, which comes from sugar cane, right? It's from a grass, has been grown and cultivated by human beings for 5,000 years. And so sugar, while it may not have been on everybody's table, it was, originally reserved for nobility or emperors, people of means, it has now become quite ubiquitous. And sugar is actually a nutrient that all kinds of organisms need and utilize, including microbes. Microbes love sugar. And so sucrose, which is what table sugar is a disaccharide. And we can see down in the lower right-hand corner that this is what that molecule is. You have a glucose, which isn't very sweet. It's a lighter flavor profile, and it helps make our gluconic and glucuronic acid, is coupled with, bonded with, fructose, which has a much sweeter profile. Like think of fruit sugar, right? Fruit can be very sweet to the taste. So this milder sugar and this very sweet sugar are bonded together, and that's what makes sucrose, our table sugar. And it's a key nutrient for the organisms. And so when I talk about sugar, I always remind people, consider the source. Again, in order to try to game our human nature, or mother nature rather, processed food companies have devised a whole range of chemicalized ingredients that don't have any calories, but also can potentially have other negative health outcomes, especially when you overconsume them. And they can end up being addictive. And now you end up in a cycle of overconsuming foods that say 0 calories on the label, but end up making your body feel really horrible, and leading to lots of other issues. And so, keep it simple. Stick with the sugar. The other thing that happens is there's a feedback loop in your brain. When you crave sugar, sometimes it means you're just thirsty, so go have a glass of kombucha first. But if you're still craving it, sometimes it means you need some nutrition, you need some energy. And when you have that little bit of sugar, it creates a reaction in your brain, and now that biofeedback loop is closed. When you consume a chemical sugar, that biofeedback loop never closes, and when you have an open circuit, the energy doesn't flow and it creates a problem. And that broken circuit is what causes you to continuously crave something because it's never completed that full biofeedback circle. So back to kombucha though. The teaspoon of sugar that helps the medicine go down. So as we're fermenting, as the kombucha is fermenting, the yeast are breaking the sugar down into these monosaccharide components. They're excreting CO2 and ethanol, which is a preservative. And then, so then the glucose and fructose are free flowing. The glucose, as I mentioned before, gets created into the gluconic and glucuronic acids, and the fructose continues feeding some of the other nutrients, both bacteria and yeast, and leads to other acids being formed. But if we were to let our kombucha go long enough, we call it kombucha vinegar. It may not technically reach that 4 to 8% acetic acid solution, but it's sour enough that we certainly aren't enjoying it by the cup. When we let it go that long, more of the sugar has been consumed and broken down. And so we harvest it at a point where it has just enough sweetness for us to enjoy, while also having that great acid content, because it's those acids that really help our body feel great. And so you can see we can also use, like everyone asks, well, do I have to buy sugar? I don't want to buy sugar. Absolutely. There's lots of other sugar sources we can use. We definitely would want to use those again with our extra scobies, with our experimental cultures, just in case they have a negative impact on our culture. If you're using something that's more mineral rich, like an unrefined brown sugar, a maple syrup, a coconut palm sugar, it can cause it to sour more quickly because those additional nutrients are just leading to a more rapid fermentation time. So this chart is out of our book and really helps you to, at least get a feel for how much time it's going to take if using a different type of sugar. tea, sugar, SCOBY. So here we are, SCOBY. They're beautiful. They're white. They look like spaceships. They're our friends. We feel emotionally connected to them. They're what I call a cross between a pet and a plant. We need to care for them just as we would a pet or a plant. Now, they're not going to crawl up on your lap and snuggle with you like your kitty or doggy will, although wouldn't that be funny? But it also means you don't have to worry about any of the kids or adults having nightmares of the slime slipping out of the jar. But also like a plant, which is more stationary, more like what we're seeing here. They require care, right? And so when we give a pet or a plant or any living being what it needs uh, in order to thrive, it will. And this is a really powerful lesson for our own bodies. So often I think the way our system is set up, we've been trained to believe that only medical professionals can understand what's happening inside of our bodies, and that, we live in this bodysuit. And so actually listening to your instincts and of course educating yourself, and look, we can't just get all of our information off of Google, and there definitely is a place and time for working with practitioners. But that was a really long, diverse way of saying trust your gut. And so the SCOBY is one of these things that we can end up with a connection with. That bacterial cellulose grows this layer, and it really becomes our friend, and we take it from batch to batch. We share it with other people, and it's incredibly dense. So if we look at it underneath an electron microscope, you see this large glob in the middle is actually a yeast cell. Yeast are far larger than bacteria. And the bacteria, what they do is their bodies excrete these filaments, these fine fibers, kind of like a silkworm. And they're just excreting all these fine fibers of connection, and eventually they thicken and they grow together. Now, one of the questions we get all the time, you're going to put your SCOBY into your vessel, and the first thing it's going to do is it's going to fall to the bottom. And so many people write us in a snit, so worried, like, oh no, did my kombucha die? The SCOBY went to the bottom. And in fact, it's perfectly normal for the SCOBY to do that. And what will happen is as the yeast convert the sugar and create the CO2, those bubbles are going to gently lift the mother back up to the surface. But in the meantime, what's happening is a new layer is starting to grow across the top. And there's a reason for this. First of all, our yeast need oxygen in order to execute their process. So one of the things you're going to see before that culture starts to really grow in is several black, brown, or green patches. The yeast can look in a variety of different ways depending on how thick or opaque or translucent the SCOBY is. But they come up to the surface first. And then you see a thin skin. So another word for SCOBY is zooglia, which means living skin, starts to form at the top. And then once that thickens, now an anaerobic process occurs below the surface, and you'll start to see more of those bubbles collecting up by there. So, and then these two SCOBYs, now one becomes two. It's literally abundance in action. It's very exciting to see this process. But that is going to create a barrier, a physical barrier that prevents other microorganisms from invading the brew. And then it becomes a SCOBY you can put into your hotel, you can give to a friend, you can turn into fruit leather, you can compost. Even if you throw it in the garbage, you're probably helping to break down the landfill. So never feel bad letting go of a SCOBY, especially if you don't have room, right? We want energy to flow. And because this is abundance in action, we don't have to feel scarcity around our kombucha cultures, because they are just going to grow and grow and grow. And they're incredibly diverse. So, looking at the pie chart, we can see that the dominant bacteria, at least in this sample of kombucha, is Gluconacidobacter species, about 39%. And then there's a couple other. There's another Gluconacidobacter saccharivans. I love practicing these. Gluconacidobacter saccharivans. 15%, Acidobacter tropicalis 20%, Acidobacter pasturanus 10%, and then a couple of others in lesser amounts. But then we see really trace amounts of all these different types of bacteria. And so when we do DNA sequencing on next-gen sequencers, we're able to find the fragments of DNA from all kinds of different elements present in kombucha, but more often than not, it's only a couple of organisms that will dominate. And in kombucha, really, there's the Acetobacter and Gluconacetabacter are the most dominant species of bacteria we're going to see in kombucha. Actually, it now has a new name. So this is kind of neat, but also frustrating in that whenever a scientist makes a major contribution to their field, oftentimes plants or organisms will be named after them. And so Dr. Komagata, Kazuo Komagata, he was a professor in Tokyo. He spent a lot of his research looking at these different organisms, and through DNA sequencing was able to identify ways in which they were different from their predecessors. And so we can see that what started as Ulvina aceti in 1834 has evolved over time into Kamatageibacter zelinus. And so when you're out there searching for information on kombucha, you can still use Gluconacetabacter, but don't be surprised when you see Kamatageibacter, as it is the same organism. And here you can see in the center another picture of the rod-shaped bacteria and all the fibers that they're releasing. And what I love to think about this is how everything is connected. Right? We think about superstring theory, we think about this planet being a web of life, an ecosystem, and how cool that all the way down to the tiniest organisms on this planet, there is a vital need for connection and being connected. So then there's yeast. And as we mentioned before, yeast are much larger. So here we can see some of our yeasty bits hanging off of our SCOBY, lingering in the liquid. And in fact, it's brown. And it might even look like seaweed. I wonder what else is a brown seaweed. Hey, kombu. Kombu is a brown seaweed from Japan, and cha means tea. Could it be that instead of calling it a kombucha mushroom because they thought it looked like a mushroom cap, they saw the yeast and said, hey, this looks like kombu. Let's call it kombucha. So this has become, again, these revelations come over many years of working with kombucha, and then just like through dreams or sudden realizations. But that, as I was researching for the book, trying to understand where did this stuff come from, it suddenly dawned on me that just as we have terms of convenience for like kefir grain, which isn't made out of grain at all, but grain indicates a small thing, that perhaps kombu in this case was a term of convenience to describe the yeast. And so yeast, if you look at the family tree here in the lower left-hand side, you see animals and fungi. So yeast are part of fungi, so we're more closely related to fungi than we are to slime molds or to plants. So we share, as we can see from the Venn diagram over here, we share 53 genes in common with yeast, across yeast and humans. So kind of interesting. We share a lot more with worms and flies, for whatever that's worth. But the yeast, as we can see, is a more complex organism. Instead of being a single cell, it also contains all kinds of elements within it. And it really is these fascinating creatures, these organisms that, along with bacteria, have evolved with human beings. So again, from sequencing, we see, look, there are a lot fewer types of yeast that will co-colonize with a kombucha culture than bacteria. And so Decara anomala, another name, or Decaras in general, are Brettanomyces. So again, in this world of yeast, there's lots of different names for the cultures, but we do see that, like our sour beer friends, the yeast that is dominant in kombucha is Brettanomyces bruxellensis. And then there can be some Saccharomyces in there as well, or Zygosaccharomyces, but really the more dominant ones are the Brettanomyces. What's interesting is these are often considered spoilage yeast in lots of other products. And in fact, if you were to have this type of yeast into a wine, you would end up with vinegar and things like that. So when you're fermenting other things at home, you do want to, especially if you're doing beer or wine and they're not sours, you do want to keep them away from your kombucha. But the yeast are sugar and caffeine lovers, and they really have created a way of working with humans. Like, we literally feed them, we cultivate them, we give them ideal conditions to reproduce. We have literally brought them with us through our journey of evolution. But of course, we wouldn't have done that if they didn't provide a payback for us. And so yeast actually contain all of the B vitamins, again, in that living form. Now, it may not be in the massive quantities, but it is in trace amounts in a living form. And so yeast are something that have come up with human beings, and we really care about and cultivate them even in our kombucha. So we talk about symbiotic culture, bacteria and yeast, and what does that mean? Well, symbiosis comes in a variety of different forms, one of which is parasiticism. And in parasiticism, only one organism benefits in that relationship. And so this is a way of remembering that while the yeast and bacteria are in symbiosis, it doesn't mean that we don't have a role to play in how they interact with each other. In fact, we are the stewards of the balance. And so recognizing the role of the yeast and bacteria and which factors they need is a way that we can help to maintain the brew and balance and make sure that both parties have exactly what they need so that they can enjoy and proliferate. And so the yeast, we think of those as the party animals. The food shows up, they dive in, they're eating all the food, right? If you have a party and everyone, if you only have party animals, your beer and wine, your pizza, it's all going to be gone right away. And there's going to be people burping and farting and cavorting and having a great time, but that might not make for the best party. Now, bacteria build structure. And so we think of them as the party planners. So they are building that network. They're holding yeast within them, kind of like layers of an apartment building. And each of those layers can actually have a sort of unique makeup when we do DNA sequencing and look at them from a layer perspective versus lateral versus medial. Sorry, I'm not getting that right. But suffice to say, if you were to cut a SCOBY in half, not down the middle, but in half like you would a cake, and of course I'm moving my arms here to show you gestures that you can't see, you would find that the top layer would be different from the bottom layer. And so the bacteria, their role is to take the CO2 and the ethanol that the yeast is excreting and to turn that into healthy acids. And so really it's these guys working together and how we work with them that creates this lovely symbiosis. So where do we get a SCOBY, right? Where did the first SCOBY come from? I get that question all the time. And my answer back is, well, where did the first human being come from? And I realize that's not a very satisfying answer because we feel like, you know, we're human beings. We know everything. We have so much science at our disposal. We should just know everything. And the reality is we can't possibly know everything. And so where do we get a SCOBY? Well, the best place is from a trusted source. And so that trusted source could be a friend, or maybe it's someone in a kombucha meetup group in your local area. And then, of course, like Kombucha Camp, there are online purveyors. And so what do you want to look like in an online purveyor? Again, we've talked about how focusing on just getting the cheapest culture may not always lead to the best results. And you could end up wasting time, effort, energy, and even get disappointed if you end up using a culture that isn't large enough, doesn't have enough starter liquid, the starter liquid isn't strong enough, you don't know what kind of environment it's been brewed in, etc. So at Kombucha Camp, we are bacteria farmers, and we use all organic ingredients. We're in a state-inspected facility, so you can trust that our products are of the highest quality. Now, it used to be you could grow your own SCOBY. You would just pour out a glass of a kombucha into a glass, put a little cover over it, and watch a SCOBY grow. And in fact, Drew and I talk about that in our other presentation where, you know, it's a great way to confirm if a brand that you're consuming is authentic. However, because of the withdrawal that happened in 2010, the main concern being alcohol. We're going to talk about alcohol in a little bit. But if we don't, just suffice to say that alcohol is a preservative in kombucha. It's not intoxicating, but it can also be over the legally prescribed limit of 0.5%. And so that has led kombucha brands to shifting their process. They have to filter it. They have to change what's going on in there. And so while they're going to yield a delicious tasting kombucha you can drink, growing a culture, which is great to see, may or may not have the same organism diversity, and therefore may not yield the best tasting over time. Because we've certainly had people grow cultures, use them, perpetuate them forward, and then when they switch to an authentic culture, one that has all that diversity, they find, oh, actually, this tastes better. And it's because it has all of those organisms present. The other thing to shy away from are dehydrated cultures. Well, we can certainly dehydrate certain organisms. Water kefir comes to mind, and they will bounce back, no problem. Kombucha's power really is in that starter liquid. And when you dehydrate the cultures, you, of course, are removing all the liquid and you're depleting their ability to care for themselves. And even if we try to acidify with vinegar, it's really unlikely it's going to bounce back. And if the first batch doesn't go to mold, the second one does. And again, you're waiting so much time to try to see if it's even going to work. Whereas if you just spend another $10, you will have kombucha in 7 to 10 days, as well as a new culture, and you'll be on your kombucha journey. So what should you look for in a kombucha culture? You want it to be healthy and white in color, to be very dense, not easily rippable. If you can press your fingers through culture easily, it's a sign that the culture is not strong, it's weak. So we're looking for 4 to 6 ounces by weight per gallon batch. You want there to be yeast, but not too yeasty. You don't want like a bunch of brown liquid. And then you do need at least 1 cup of starter liquid per gallon. Now that we've covered the ingredients, let's talk about brewing conditions, right? So we've talked about the tea, the sugar, the SCOBY, the starter liquid. Those are all of the ingredients we need to make perfect kombucha. However, there's several other conditions that contribute to a good batch. And so we have vessel types. How large should your kombucha container be? Well, you want to have it large enough to make enough kombucha so you can enjoy it. Typically, people will start in a batch brew, in a 1-gallon batch. Sometimes folks will do smaller batches, but really 1 gallon is sort of the standard measure. And the reason we like to do a larger batch is because it takes 7 to 14 days making you can then drink the kombucha of that 1 gallon while you're waiting for the next one to finish. So typically, as soon as that batch is finished, you're going to take out your scobies, take out your starter liquid for the next batch. You'll then drain that vessel and flavor it, and then immediately start your next batch. Now, of course, if your consumption rate's a little slower, you might wait and then start it a couple days later. But that's totally, at your own pace. And what's really nice is the book has, the Big Book of Kombucha has a chart that helps you figure out, okay, if I want to drink this much kombucha, what size batch should I be making? So check out the book for that info. And then there's 2 types of brewing. There's batch brewing and there's continuous brew. So while people will often start with batch brew because the investment's a little lower, glass jars are pretty easy to source. They're not very expensive. Continuous brew containers are larger. They can be a little more expensive, and the knowledge and know-how is a little more intricate. However, many people will convert from batch to continuous because they find it just streamlines the whole process. And so we're going to talk about continuous brew in a little bit, but these are some of the vessel types that we're going to discuss. So let's take a look at glass. Glass is an inert material. It's corrosive resistant. It's not porous. And so it's basically a contamination-free type of vessel. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get mold in glass. Of course, the product itself may not have enough heat. It might be in a place near mold spores or things like that. But it's a really great material that's easy to sanitize, easy to work with. But of course, when you're working with it, if the jar is full, it can be heavy. The glass will weaken over time as it's exposed to the low pH of the kombucha, and so it can just shatter and break, even if you didn't drop it on the floor. And it's often difficult to source in larger sizes, again, because of its fragile nature. Glass often does not have a spigot unless you're looking at like a sun tea jar, so it can be more difficult to execute a continuous brew process with a glass vessel. Another negative is that it is a clear vessel, and that means if it's in a direct sunlight, it can have a negative impact on the kombucha culture. Plus, if you have people in the family who maybe aren't as keen on your kombucha brewing and are grossed out by it, it can be a little offensive. And so you may prefer to use a vessel that's opaque, so that way everybody's happy. Nobody's freaked out by the kombucha, and so but glass is easy to source and something to use that many people use right away. In terms of should you have a spigot or no spigot, the spigot definitely makes it easier to dispense the kombucha from the vessel. We would highly recommend going with stainless steel. We use food grade plastic and wood spigots as well, but the style. So you can see here that the style of the stainless steel spigot is different from the plastic. The plastic is like a lever that you lift up and down, just like on any sort of water drinking fountain you might have seen. They have the big bottles there. But this spigot is faucet style, as I call it. So it goes from right to left. And when you close it, it's more airtight. And that's important because when we're talking about kombucha, that SCOBY is always going to grow wherever it's exposed to oxygen. And so by making that airtight, you're limiting the ability of it to grow SCOBYs in the spigot, which can happen in the food grade plastic or the wood because they're not closing as tightly. Also, this then has a faster flow rate, so it takes less time when you're filling up your bottles. Now, a bunch of fake plastic spigots with metallic paint on them, those absolutely need to be replaced right away. That paint will chip into your kombucha, it'll give it a funky flavor, and you do not want to be consuming that stuff. And that plastic is also cheaper. You can tell when you look at it underneath, it's less opaque, it's more translucent, which means it isn't as stable for using with a low acid product like kombucha. Next, of course, we have food grade porcelain, ceramic, and stoneware. So back in the day when there wasn't an internet and this was sort of like friendship bread where people were passing it around, there were a couple of rules that came with kombucha, and one of them was never brew in ceramic. Now, this rule was good at that time because with limited access to information, it was best to just be safe than sorry. But really what that whole concept was referring to was non-food grade ceramics. And the reason for that is, like this beautiful little pot down here in the right-hand corner, lead can be added to glazes to create these bright, vibrant colors. And so if you're going to a thrift store and you're just finding, oh, this looks cool, let me do my kombucha in here, if it's not intended for food grade, it can actually leach lead into your brew. And that, of course, is something we all want to avoid. Unfortunately, even some of the old, porcelain plates and things like that, or colored glassware, have been found to have lead in it as well. So you really want to stick with something that's food grade, is lead free, and so porcelain and stoneware and ceramic are all glazed, which has the same root as glass, right? And so when you put a piece of pottery into the kiln, the high temperatures fuse that liquid, the minerals in the liquid glaze, and turn it into glass. And so porcelain and ceramic and stoneware with food grade glaze are just like glass in that it's an inert material, it's corrosive resistant, and it's really great to work with. So cannot say enough about porcelain. I think it's a really great material to work with and easy to use. Then there's stainless steel. Now, stainless steel is incredibly popular in the commercial fermentation, beer, wine, all kinds of industries use stainless steel. It's more expensive and it can scratch if not handled properly, which can lead to corrosion. And it does need to be 304 grade and higher. There's some grades of stainless steel that are lesser grades in the 200s, and they are not as corrosive resistant. But for the low amount of acetic acid that's present in our product, 304 grade and higher does work. It's ideal for continuous brew. It's very lightweight, so when it comes time to clean this vessel, unlike the glass, unlike the porcelain or the stoneware, it's going to be very easy to lift. So that can be a huge bonus for older folks or people who have mobility issues, because it is also, if you accidentally drop it, it's not going to break potentially in the same way the other pieces would. Also, it comes in a large variety of sizes, but again, it is a more expensive material. But it might also match your kitchen appliances, so that could be another reason to go with the stainless steel. Then there are oak barrels. So toasted oak barrels have been used by human beings for a really long time. We've been putting wine in them, oil, maybe not oil, wine and other perishable sauerkraut. So oak has been used as a material for fermenting and for food storage for centuries, millennia, and so forth. And so the oak, just like it lends a unique flavor profile to wine, also lends a unique flavor profile to kombucha. Um, However, it does need to be kept full at all times, and that's because it's a living material. It's porous, and the microorganisms are going to take up residence in the wood. Now, the thing is, whenever you allow water to come into contact with wood, you're naturally releasing the sugars present in the wood. And those sugars are delicious to all kinds of things, including mold. And so in beer, in wineries and breweries, it's the high alcohol content that preserves the barrels and prevents mold from growing in them. And with kombucha, it's our low pH. And so we do need to keep it full at all times. Also, these barrels can, even if you've had them for years, all of a sudden they might spring a little leak. And that's perfectly normal because, again, the wood, it expands, it contracts, it's influenced by temperature and things like that. However, you can use a little bit of beeswax or wax and apply that to the outside of the barrel, and that's going to prevent those leaks from continuing to spread. You do also want to make sure that the spigot you're using doesn't contain any brass elements. Brass, while it's safe to use with beer because their pH isn't as low, is not safe to use with kombucha. So do not use any brass elements with your barrel. The nice thing is you can also customize them. You can engrave them and you know, put something fun across the top, and they come in a variety of sizes. So food grade plastic is also a material that we often see in commercial kombucha brewing. And this is because it's lightweight, it's inexpensive, and it comes in so many different sizes. Now, we sometimes take a negative perspective on plastic, and for lower density plastics like PET, you definitely don't want to use those. However, high density polyethylene has been shown to work. And so some people will choose to brew in plastic because it just makes better sense for them. Now it does have some brewers have reported, oh my gosh, I was using this type of vessel, I went to plastic, and my brews just don't taste as good. The SCOBY's not as happy. So for whatever it's worth, whether that's actually due to the plastic or just they don't like change, you know, some people also choose not to brew in plastic and specifically highlight that they don't use plastic. So really comes down to a personal choice. We don't recommend using the lower quality plastics that you see in 2-liter bottles and things like that, because they do have the potential for leaching. And of course, the whole reason we're drinking kombucha is to prevent getting more toxins into our bodies. So that's why you often see them in glass when it comes to bottles. One of the key factors for brewing conditions is location. Um, One of the important factors to consider, I mean, there's lots of factors to consider as we can see here from this slide, which is jam-packed with information. So first of all, airflow is really key. As we mentioned before, the oxygen is important for the interchange. So unlike using an airlock as we would with some other types of fermentation that specifically prevent oxygen from getting into the brew, that's not the case with kombucha. Now, cheesecloth, the weave is too loose. I know there's an old saying, you could attract more flies with honey than vinegar, but in the case of fruit flies, which are also known as vinegar flies, the exact opposite is true. They love kombucha, they love vinegar, they love sour and tangy, and they are pesky buggers, and they will wiggle their way through your many layers of cheesecloth and invade your brew, and nobody wants to deal with that. So use a tightly woven cloth, cotton, breathable. It could even be an old t-shirt as long as there aren't any holes on top that would allow the fruit flies to get in. So there's lots of ways we can use different types of covers to get that airflow. Temperature is a huge factor, and we're going to talk about these in more detail. Exposure to sunlight. There's going to be conditions to avoid, such as cigarette smoke, being in stuffy or unventilated areas. If there's a really high humidity, that's mold loves to thrive in that, and that can be adverse to your cultures. Having it right next to the stove is not always good because grease and other fumes can potentially contaminate the brew. Direct sunlight is another thing to watch out for, as is pollen from other house plants. So we want to keep it away from those. Some folks think, well, hey, let me stick it in a laundry room or a basement or garage, which can be perfectly fine, except if there are toxic chemicals and other things nearby, you definitely want to make sure it's away from there. So some of the more common places we see people putting their kombucha brewers and jars is on the kitchen counter. nice and easy. It's in the kitchen, in a cupboard. On top of the refrigerator, you get a little benefit from the exhaust coming off the back there, or in a pantry. Those are all bedrooms, and closets are also common for brewing locations. So temperature and humidity. Kombucha has an ideal temperature range of 75 to 85, with 80 being the sweet spot. So that's a lot warmer than most of us are keeping our homes. We could crank up the thermostat in the home. We could put a space heater in a room, or the most economical way is to grab a fermentation heater. They use lower wattage. They are localized in that they're heating up the brew that you're working with, and they can be really easy to use. So there's a lot of different ways. You don't necessarily have to use our USA made super simple heating systems. There's a lot of different things you can use, including placing it near a crock pot or putting it in the laundry room near the dryer to take advantage of heat that already exists. But if you're finding it's still not getting to the temperature you like, or it's a little hard to control, the heaters are really helpful. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a symbiosis, and so rather than putting a heater and then placing the vessel on top of it so it's sitting on top of it and the heat is coming from the bottom, that can cause the yeast to become overactive. When the yeast finish their process at the surface, they then drop to the bottom. And if we heat from the bottom, we're consistently reactivating the yeast, which can throw the brew out of balance. It can cause off flavors. And so that's why we like to wrap it around the shoulders or up at the top where the bacteria are. So in that balance, we are always nurturing the structure. We're always nurturing the bacteria. It's why we take our starter liquid right off the top as opposed to using the yeasty dregs at the bottom. So humidity is also important to take into consideration. If it's too dry, sometimes in the desert, a lot of evaporation occurs, and you might notice that your hotels need refreshing more often. If a layer dries out too much, it can potentially cause mold, even if part of it is in liquid, and so we need to be conscientious that it's not too dry. On the opposite end, if it's too humid, as I mentioned before, that can lead to mold. So there seems to be a nice, 50 to 60% humidity when you're looking at your fermentation room is like an ideal range. And even if you don't have a heater, it's so important to understand the temperature of your brew. A thermometer strip on your vessel is the easiest way to monitor it at all times. So these brewing metrics, some of them are going to be basic, but most of them are more advanced. So most people who are making kombucha, this slide isn't really going to be relevant to you because you're not necessarily needing to test all these things. Your tongue is the most sensitive pH meter, taste tester, Brix, refractometer out there. However, it's really difficult to get a numerical value off of your tongue because it simply doesn't work that way. And this is where using these tools can be really helpful, especially if you're a commercial producer who's trying to key in on a flavor profile. We used to just talk about pH and Brix. pH is also a critical control point. So when it comes time to make your HACCP plan, which is a hazardous and critical control points plan, or your food safety plan, pH is crucial to identify and log and monitor. And Brix is just really a helpful tool. While it's not a critical control point, it's helpful to understand how much sugar are we starting with, because what we're looking for is a balance between the sweet and the sour. Now, the thing about the pH is it's not precise enough to tell us how much actual acidity is being produced. And that's where titratable acidity, which is sort of this third level, more advanced measurement, comes into play. So titratable acidity is measured through a whole chemical process where you have a buffering agent, you're then adding that to a solution. There's a lot of kits where then once the color changes to a certain color, you then count the number of drops you used, you put it into a calculator, and that tells you your acidity. Or there's more expensive equipment like the thing pictured here that's, again, hooked up to a reagent, a buffer solution. The probe goes into it, and it creates this entire chemical reaction in order to spit out a number on the screen. And so this, again, is probably not something most folks are going to use in-house, although the refractometer can be helpful, especially for folks who are looking to monitor the sugars in their brew or other things. And it can also be helpful for doing a really rough estimate on alcohol in kombucha, but because kombucha is such a complex matrix and acetic acid is very similar to ethanol, oftentimes your readings will be negative or they won't be totally accurate. And so it's definitely not a way to accurately measure any of that information, but it can give you sort of a ballpark sense of where you're at. So this chart I've tried to make a little simpler with my up and down arrows, and it really shows the major chemical the changes in kombucha over time. And so this was a black tea kombucha. It is a 0 to 21 day ferment, and you can see that they took measurements on day 0, 7, 14, and 21. So every week for 3 weeks, they took these values. And what we see, of course, is the pH decreases. That means it's getting lower on the pH scale, more acidic. And of course, that naturally means acetic acid as well as titratable acidity are increasing. All the acids are increasing. We do see some that sort of go up and down, like ethanol and sugar, which again makes sense. As we mentioned before, in the fermentation process, the yeast spit out ethanol and CO2, but then that ethanol gets converted into healthy acids. And this is why we can't make a high alcohol kombucha unless we're adding additional types of yeast, because naturally, because of that vinegaration process, because we're tea vinegar, that ethanol gets converted into those healthy acids. Theaflavin and thearubigen are elements of tea. They're some of the antioxidants. And what's interesting is we see the theaflavin increases as the thearubigen decreases. And the paper posited that was because the thearubigen is being broken into smaller components, which is measurable through the theaflavin. So as it breaks down the nutrients, similar to like the caffeine decreasing, it causes an increase in other nutrients. So vitamin C is also increased in the kombucha fermentation process compared to what's in the tea, as well as the B vitamins. And so many of the nutrients are enhanced, but a lot of them are kind of shifting up and down in fluctuation as the process goes on. As promised, alcohol. So it's interesting living in a country that was founded by Puritans that actually executed prohibition and then a few years later canceled it. So we kind of have an inconsistent relationship with alcohol, and even our drinking age more closely reflects the culture of Saudi Arabia and countries that are a lot less tolerant of alcohol than our European predecessors. And of course, not everyone in the US has a European heritage, but obviously we know that's the dominant number of people who came over here. What this all means, though, is that the 0.5% that was called an alcoholic beverage from prohibition still exists in the law today. And many countries around the world have adopted this definition, but not all of them. For example, our neighbors to the north, Canada, it's 1.15%. In the EU, we see anywhere from 0.5% all the way up to, I believe it's 4% in Finland. I guess those people really know how to drink. It's very cold there. But long story short, there are trace amounts of alcohol in kombucha that are a preservative. They're not intoxicating, but they can be more than the legal limit. And this has created a lot of drama in our industry. And really, it really makes me sad when I see brands attacking other brands over alcohol level, because all they're doing is trying to force other brands off the shelf, not based on flavor profile, not based on being a superior product, but because, they figured something out that the other people haven't. And I'm not saying everyone should be breaking the law, but what we're talking about here is, minuscule amounts of alcohol that literally don't cause inebriation. Children drink kombucha. They absolutely love it. Monitor them. Are they acting like they're drunk? Probably not. They're probably acting, less crazy than they normally are, because they're not hopped up on weird chemicals you find in sugary drinks and sodas and whatnot. Human beings evolved with alcohol. Alcohol is our original medicine. All disease is related to stress, and alcohol immediately releases stress. My personal weird fermenter theory is that when we pasteurize alcohol, like we do with beer, or we add chemical sulfites, which essentially pasteurizes wine, it turns it into a controlled substance. Because the reason humans crave alcohol isn't because they're looking to get drunk per se, it's because they know the yeast are present. The yeast have all the nutrients in a living form, plus when you ferment something, you make more of those healthy elements present. So like an elderberry wine is something that would be wonderful in the winter because it's going to help support your upper respiratory system. And in fact, when you look at something like a Jägermeister, they have this secret recipe of like 100 different herbs. Like this is herbal medicine in practice. Uh, Unless of course you overconsume it, but that's like everything, you too much water you'll drown, not enough water you'll dehydrate. So everything is about being in balance. This is my long diatribe and way to say don't worry about the alcohol. It really isn't something that creates a negative impact on the body. And in fact, because of the healthy acids that support a healthy liver, you're really like, you're getting a little antidote with your poison, especially when you mix it with alcohol, where you can enjoy the sort of buzz and rush of alcohol, but not necessarily pay a price on the other end. And what I have personally noticed, and I have heard many people echo, is that drinking kombucha over time causes them to crave alcohol less. And kombucha becomes the substitute for alcohol. So, in fact, it's really this cultural misunderstanding around alcohol, its true function, and how it works specifically in fermented foods that are not pasteurized, that have all of the nutrients present in that living form. That's where that's where we want our alcohol. We want it in that really authentic way that human beings have consumed it for so long. And it's not easy to measure. And so worrying about it as a home brewer is really, there's really not much to worry about there. So you would have to send it to a lab to get a more precise information. There's a couple different methods, and you can check out the kombuchabrewers.org website to learn more about those issues. And in fact, the association is working to solve some of these problems. While we're not looking to change the definition of an alcoholic beverage right now, we are asking that there be some tax breaks for brands that have kombucha products that are up to 1.25% ABV in order so that their product doesn't have to bear the same financial burden as an alcoholic beverage that is intended to inebriate does. So you can learn more about that at kombuchabrewers.org. Brewing style. So as we've alluded to before and talked about, there's batch brew and continuous brew. So this is sort of the breakdown of batch brew. And if you want this recipe, it's really easy to get. You just go to the Kombucha Camp website, click on recipe, you'll download it, you'll get brewing logs with it as well. And so, or you can just read it off the page, it's right there. We do what we call a shortcut method. The reason, as we've mentioned before, is our organisms are temperature sensitive. So again, anyone who's ever like baked bread with commercial yeast and you have that little yeast packet, it says don't get this above lukewarm water. So our method is designed to steep the tea, dissolve the sugar, but then dilute it with cool water so you can very quickly add the SCOBY and starter liquid in, which has a couple benefits. You're protecting that sugared tea from invasion from other organisms, and you're starting that process a lot more quickly. And so all we do is we boil 4 cups of water. We then steep our tea. Each tea bag is about 1 teaspoon of tea. So if you're looking at this, 4 to 6 teaspoons is 4 to 6 tea bags. And then after it's done steeping, we remove our tea bags or our tea strainer, and then we pour in our sugar. And then we stir that. We stir that really good with our spoon. That dissolves the sugar. We stir in love. We stir in dreams, right? We can all say that we feel love. Like we know what that feels like. We may not be able to put it in a bottle per se and like, here, drink this, it's love. But we can feel it. And so when foods are made with love, that actually is a nourishing ingredient. And so often processed foods are devoid of love, whereas making something yourself, you get to imprint that personal energy into it. So once we've diluted it with cool water, we're then adding our SCOBY and starter liquid. That starter liquid goes in last. It is that, it's going to lower the pH, and it's also going in last because we want it to act like a barrier to prevent mold and things from being able to grow on there. We then cover it with our cloth cover and rubber band, make sure that's nice and secure. And then we give it some time and space. Again, if we're new to kombucha and we come back and start peeking in there, we might get freaked out because we don't know what we're looking at. Of course, if that ever happens, just take a photo, send it to us. We're always happy to help you understand what you're looking at. So then wait, come back in 5 days, 7 days. You're then going to slip a straw or somehow procure a sample of it. Once you ascertain that it has the sweet sour balance you like best, then you're ready to decant. So if you take that sip and it still tastes sweet to you, give it another couple of days and try it again. If you come over and it's already tasting tangier than you prefer, that's a sign that next time you need to shorten that fermentation cycle. So at the end of that cycle, as we mentioned before, you're going to have the baby that's right on top, and then you're going to have the mother underneath. So we're going to immediately move the baby and the mother into a bowl, and then right from the top, we're going to pour 1 to 2 cups of starter liquid. As I mentioned before, the yeast, when they're done with their process, they fall to the bottom of the jar. And when that happens, they then are, they're not able to what happens is then the starter liquids gets too yeasty and it throws the brew out of balance. And so it's really important that we're taking that starter liquid from the top. The rest of it is then yours. And in fact, you want the yeast in the bottles because the yeast is what's going to help give the carbonation. And then we have continuous brew. So I know we say we don't brew in glass, but this was the perfect vessel to demonstrate this process. The reason we don't care for this vessel is the glass is kind of thin, and we felt that over time it would quickly shatter, and nobody wants a vessel to come back and find their kombuchas all over the countertop and they have a nice mess to clean up. But it's a great way to visualize the process and what's going on here. So we're doing a larger batch. Usually a 2.5 gallon vessel yields a 2-gallon batch. We can also do 5 gallons and even larger sometimes. Now the concept is that unlike batch brew where we're at the end of the cycle, we then drain everything out and start over fresh again. In this case, we're only draining out a portion. And so we're taking out 25 to 50% at the most. So when we drain that down and we leave the rest of this kombucha in there, notice we've left a large amount of kombucha. And that's because we don't just want to leave the yeasty dregs, as we mentioned, because that will throw the brew out of balance. So we leave a good amount so that both the bacteria and yeast are still in balance. And now when we add our sweet tea to it, instead of taking 7 to 14 days in a batch brew, it's only going to take a few days before it's ready again. And so there's some really great benefits to this process. So it's easy. Everything is coming out of the spigot. There's less cleanup, less mess. The brewing time is shortened, so that makes it easy. Let's say you need to take a break. It can act like your SCOBY hotel. You go on vacation, you come back to kombucha, something happens in life and you have to go away from it. As long as there's enough liquid, the SCOBYs will remain viable. Now you drain out some of that sour stuff, what we call kombucha vinegar. You top it off with your sweet tea. You're back to your kombucha in just a couple of days instead of having to wait for that whole cycle again. We also only clean it once every 3 to 6 months, which means there's less work involved. And we do that based on taste. And again, it's because when those yeast have overgrown on the bottom, it causes the brew to sour more quickly, and that's how we know it's time to go in and thin that herd and clean it out and reset it. It's also safer because we're not handling the cultures as much, which means there's less potential for contamination, and the SCOBYs are always in a pH protected environment. It's also healthier because those acids we mentioned about how they go up later in the process, 30 days in a 1-gallon jar may not taste very good to most people. And so by leaving so much of the kombucha fermenting in the vessel while then adding sweet tea to it allows for that longer fermentation time. We're then tempering the flavor with the sweet tea, and we're actually leading to the formation of more of those healthy acids that help support a healthy liver. Flavor and fizz, it's all about the fizz. We love the fizz. It's because it's yeast, man. All right. The flavoring is so much fun. People love flavoring kombucha. Back in the day, they just drank it sour and straight. These days, of course, we see kombucha on the shelves in a zillion different flavors, and it's so fun and creative. It's really one of the really fun parts of kombucha is just thinking of what's the next flavor I'm going to try. So when I was first coming up with kombucha flavors, I looked out into my garden. I saw these great herbs. I had lavender and rosemary and thyme. I went to the farmer's market. There were fruits in season. And it's, a really common way to make a flavor is to combine a fruit with an herb or a spice. And then there's an infinite number of those you can do. In our book, we have 260 flavoring suggestions. And you want to, you want less surface area. Now, personally, I still prefer to use the pieces of fruit as you see here. I just feel like what other elements are missing if I only use juice. I just prefer it. That's just me. Now, some people prefer juice because that means you don't have to strain this stuff out, and that makes it easier. So again, it's so customizable. It's really picking what feels good to you. Instead of putting the herbs directly in the kombucha, you could also infuse them like a tea or tisane and pour that in. And remember, because fermentation enhances the nutritional qualities of whatever we're fermenting, those things you're putting in there, and you can see these are strawberries, but they look white. And that's because the organisms have extracted the anthocyanins, the things that give them that color, those antioxidants, and pass it into the brew. And that's also why kombucha has these beautiful, brilliant colors, is because it's pulling that naturally from the different elements you're flavoring it with. So you can also go, you can go as tangy with it. You can go savory with it. You can make salsa kombucha, mushroom kombucha. There's even bacon kombucha in our book. So remember, vinegar is super flexible. You can go sweet, savory, wherever you want to go herbal. There's going to be a flavor for you. Now, when we fill the bottles all the way to the top, we reduce the amount of head space. Some people will complain, oh, I got a little SCOBY growing in my bottle. How do I prevent that? Well, the way you prevent that is by minimizing the amount of oxygen in the bottle. And so you do that by filling it to the top. It also means CO2, which is a gas, will stay more infused in the liquid. And using a tight cap is going to keep it on nice and strong. Yeast are temperature sensitive, so let's say you've got great fizz in your bottle, you stick it in the fridge and all your fizz goes away. Totally normal. And don't worry, it will come back as soon as you bring it out of the fridge, because remember, this isn't forced carbonation, this is natural effervescence, and so it's going to ebb and flow with the temperature. If it's forced carbonation, like we find in sodas, and often a lot of commercial kombuchas use forced carbonation, then it will keep that fizz no matter what. And even sometimes you'll have really fizzy bottles from the fridge, but all of that is to say it's somewhat inconsistent. And so honing in, understanding why it gets fizzy or doesn't, allows you to then more evenly distribute your yeast. Make sure you're stirring right before you decant. That's going to spread the yeast into the liquid. Same with the continuous brew. You know, nudge your scobies aside, give it a good stir, and then decant. That's going to get you more fizz in your bottles. Styles of kombucha, there are so many. This is what's really neat about being here and now with kombucha. Currently we're working on a standard of identity for kombucha, and if we had done that when we first formed in 2014, it would just be tea, sugar, and SCOBY. But of course, we've seen an amazing evolution because of the flexibility of these organisms and these cultures. So we have herbal kombuchas, often called airbucha. We have coffee kombucha, which has some funny names, kombufi or kafucha. We have yerbucha, which is yerba mate or yopan. These are holly plants native to North and South America. And all of these can be used to make different types of kombucha. We have jun, which is kombucha's raw honey-loving cousin, whether it was its own culture from the mountains of Tibet, as some legends suggest, or somebody just evolved a kombucha culture to enjoy raw honey. It does have its own unique flavor profile, and it's really fun to see all of these great creative drinks coming into the marketplace as well, giving people a whole range of options they didn't have before. So how do we want to consume our kombucha? Most often at the store, you're finding it in a bottle. That's what a lot of people use at home. And there's lots of different types of bottles. So the brown bottles, and I alluded to this when I was in the presentation with Drew, but the brown bottles are called Boston Rounds. They have kind of an apothecary look. And if we look at the Health Aid bottle, it originally started as a Boston Round, and then they evolved it. They did a custom mold, and they changed the shape slightly. You can see they embossed their name on it. And so often as a brand grows, it's going to it will often ultimately find a custom bottle because sometimes standard bottles will run out of stock, and that can be nerve-wracking and difficult, especially if you've got a big production run coming up. Now, swing tops are a really popular bottle that people use at home. They hold pressure, they have thicker glass. I would recommend using a towel over the top to open it. One bonked me in the back of the hand once, and now I prefer to just use screw top bottles, but that's my personal preference. Beer bottles and growlers are also commonly used. They may need a capper if you're doing beer bottles. And often the beer bottle glass can be a little thin, and so I don't recommend beer bottles for longer term storage or fermentation of kombucha because they can turn into bottle bombs, and that glass just doesn't hold as much pressure. Then there are juice bottles, barbecue bottles. There's all kinds of bottles that you can see kombucha in, and so you can also repurpose kombucha from the store and put a different cap on it. a nice hard polycarbonate cap like you see the black ones here. The white cap is a softer plastic and it doesn't hold the carbonation as well. So even though it's great for single use, oftentimes if you're reusing those bottles, you're going to want to just grab a replaceable bottle cap that's of that polycarbonate harder plastic to keep more of the fizz in. Kegs are another great way. And because homebrewing is such a popular hobby, thanks of course to Charlie Papazian, whose passion for homebrewing really sparked the whole craft beer market. But kombucha is also really great on tap as well. And so if you're homebrewing, you're probably going to find old Corny kegs, Cornelius kegs. Although if you're a commercial producer, Sankey kegs is the more common keg. And then of course we have one-way kegs emerging, which is great because then you don't have to get the keg back, but then can present some challenges when it comes to recycling and things like that. So everybody sort of picks what works for them, but kombucha on tap is really fun, and put a little kegerator in your fridge and enjoy kombucha on tap at home. The newest trend in kombucha is cans. And so we're seeing a lot of kombucha products in cans. I've spoken to different producers and they've all assured me they've done testing and that, the liners aren't leaching. So what's great about a kombucha in a can, although some of us purists, of course, would never go out of glass. My kombucha is always in glass, but that's just me. Is that you can take a can to the beach. They're more lightweight, they're easier to ship. They can be prone to exploding if they are temperature abused, so you still need to treat them with respect. It's still a living ferment in there. But cans are just more convenient in a lot of different ways, and they're less expensive than glass and are less heavy and therefore easier for transport. So our last slide here to wrap it all up is just some other tools we want to have in our belt, and that's the SCOBY Hotel. So the kombucha culture is highly prolific, and there is no reason not to have a few extras on hand. And so SCOBY Hotel, living it up in the Hotel Scobyfornia, such a lovely place. All right, so that's basically just kombucha cultures in a jar. It's pretty straightforward. You want to keep a few extras on hand. You maybe don't need to keep this many on hand, but having a few extras is great for when you want to give them to friends, you want to, share with someone else, or maybe your culture gets mold for some reason. So, keep one or two on hand. That way you won't necessarily have to get another one. And then you can use them for your experiments and all kinds of things. They also are great for composting. People make earrings out of them. I grind them up in the blender and put them on my face. You can put them on your face without the blender. They make great bandages. Pets love them. Like there's like literally an infinite number of things you can do with the SCOBY, and that's why we think of kombucha as snout to tail. Everything can be used with it. Even if you end up with old kombucha that you don't want to drink, pouring it down the drain, acetic acid is a drain cleaner. So you're really doing your pipes a favor by dumping that booch. So don't feel bad ever about letting it flow through. Just remember, this is abundance in action, and it is going to regenerate as long as you give it more food to eat. And this is it, guys. Like, I'm just so excited to have this opportunity to share so much information. This was a really long presentation. Hopefully you made it all the way through to the end. You might have had to press pause and come back to it later. But, we are passionate about what we do. We love helping people learn how to do this, to reclaim this ancient art of fermentation. We see it as a gateway into loving other fermented foods and really thinking about the world from a bacterial perspective, or a different type of perspective than what our culture has prescribed for us. So if you need help figuring out what's right for you, give me a call, check us out online, find us on the interwebs. We are here to help you, and we really want to see you flourish and grow. So remember the Kombucha Camp motto and trust your gut.